Professor Family, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you.
So this is the Business Ethics Pioneers Project, and we wanted to get an idea of how you contributed to the beginning and the development of this field. So as we start, can you give us a little bit of information about yourself? How did you get to be the person you are today?
Thank you very much. Well, I graduated from the law school in Paris, at the University of Paris too, and then I started writing a PhD on trusts, actually the French version of trusts and how the French system could integrate the trusts with many issues on domestic and private international law. And once I had written my PhD, you've got this system in France, you have to go for qualifications and national qualifications. So that's how I made it, because I really wanted to join the academia. And meanwhile, I started working in a law firm. Once I got qualified, I passed the different interviews with various universities, and I integrated the University of Cergy Pontoise, which is just outside Paris. And basically I had a choice, but I made that choice because now it's a little bit less, but it's a young university compared to the others. It was established in 1990, and it's a very dynamic university where the faculty members are invited to have projects, to lead projects. And so very quickly, actually, I started having responsibilities at the law school level. And so basically I left the law firm and I became a permanent and full-time faculty member at the University of Cergy Pontoise.
And tell me about the topic of trust. Why did you choose trust?
Well, because at that time, the French legislator wanted to integrate the trust system into the French law. But it is a very sensitive question because it actually implies to revise part of the property law, part of the contracts law. And so it was a very difficult issue to address. So this was the reason why I mainly, worked on trust. But the whole idea of having, let's say, one person being in charge of someone else's interests was very interesting to me, at also a global level. So with many private international law questions, and the law which is to apply to the trust, and how we can integrate the trust into the French system. By what mean? Is it a contract? Is it not a contract? Is it an institution? Not an institution? Etc. etc.
So you had a great deal of fun with that.
I did.
Okay. And it sounds like you're having a great deal of fun today as a professor at Université de Cergy Pontoise. So help me understand how you first encountered this emerging field called ethics and compliance.
Well, it goes back to 2006, because I studying actually various comparative laws and mainly the US law. I had this feeling that we were facing laws which had more and more extraterritorial impact. And so the French business was going to be impacted by these major laws. And when I started talking to the business in France, in major multinational companies, they really confirmed this concern, because they had started feeling and experiencing the application of the US laws and regulations, not only the FCPA, even though the enforcement at that time had started at the, it was not what it was going to be a few years later. But we had also the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which had just passed, and obviously it had a huge impact on French companies. And so it was very interesting for me to see that even in France, we had a start of what we call today transparency in business. We had many, many laws also integrating criteria of, extra financial criteria to be able to evaluate the performance of the business, and more obligations which were what we call now very easily the CSR obligations. So it looked that the whole business ethics was going somewhere new, and new ethical issues were to be integrated at a stage where the French law was very different, not necessarily receptive. And obviously the business was facing the issue to know how they were going to deal, because at the same time they had to be compliant with the US regulation. But at the same time they were operating in France, and France did not recognize many of the maybe of the duties or of the obligations which were imposed to these companies. I'm thinking of just a very simple thing, which is a code of conduct, where the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires a code of conduct. The question was to know how they were going to be able to implement the code of conduct in France, when the concept was not really recognized by the hard law and so by the regulation. So that was the start of the idea to maybe bring the legal profession to think about the legal aspects and the legal issues of all these different questions and these new matters. And I really felt that future graduates of the law school had something to look into, and that the legal aspects were going to be more and more important in ethics and compliance. And this is how actually I started talking with compliance officers. And even that was very interesting, because the compliance officers I started meeting in France were not at all from the same background as the compliance officers I was meeting in the United States, for example. Even today, it's quite, still the same. It's changing. I could see that in the United States, there were mostly all of them coming from a legal background. They were all either lawyers, former prosecutors, and then gradually they had joined the business, and they had started counseling, and then one thing leading to the other, they had been offered the position of a compliance officer. In France, it was very, very different. I think it was more important to have someone from the inside, knowing the background of the company, knowing the culture of the company. And so once I met, an engineer who was the compliance officer. The next time I was meeting a former head of HR who was the compliance officer. And then the next time I was meeting someone who came from the communication and was, a compliance officer. And so this was also very intriguing, because I could, see and feel that the questions which were at debate, at stake, were legal issues. Let's say 80% of the time. And these legal issues were going to get bigger and bigger and more important. And so this is how I thought maybe it would be interesting if we could try and study the links between law and business ethics. And this is how actually I got the idea of launching a first university chair, which is just an initiative which brings together scholars, people from the academia, people from the business, to sort of think together about law and business ethics, and the legal and the links between law and business ethics. And so this is how I met the very first pioneers in France. I think one of them very well. It's Emmanuel Loulain, who had just been appointed as the ethics officer for L'Oréal. And so I just sent an email to Emmanuel telling him, listen, I've got this initiative. I think It would be interesting in education and in research to think about law and business ethics, that he immediately wrote back. I think it took just a few minutes when I got the answer from Emmanuel, saying we have to meet. So this is how I met Emmanuel Lulin, and this is how the whole initiative started. It all started actually in 2007. The very first conferences we started launching took place in 2007, January 2007. And then gradually it was in July, the question was to know, and that was still thanks to Emmanuel, to know if there was, you know, a specific program to set up, and obviously he was very, very favorable and very enthusiastic. I thought it may be better to wait a few years and start thinking the whole process and you know, leading more, you know, making more conferences, think tanks, organizing symposiums, launching research before we, you know, we face the educational part. But he thought that, you know, you had to start immediately, because no one was doing that, and it was a real, and he actually agreed that it was a real, let's say, project for the future of graduates of the law school. So this is how, but it's very difficult in France, because you have to submit a project to the government, I mean to the Ministry of Higher Education and Research. And basically I was doing that in the midterm of our contract with the ministry, because every 5 years we are evaluated and we sign a contract for the next 5 years. So it's very difficult in, you know, mid-time to be able to submit projects. But we actually would set up a project thinking about how education would be and how it could be organized. And I also benefited from the support of other, you know, wonderful people whom in France were very in favor, like Dominique de la Garandrie, who was the very first female president of the bar of Paris, and very, very committed to ethics and compliance. And also, you know, she brought her support to the whole initiative. And it was a huge surprise to see that the ministry followed. And we got the authorizations to open a program, a master, which actually corresponds to the 2 last years of the law school in France, and a master program in law and business ethics with different paths. And so bringing this new area of specialization to the students of the School of Law.
What have been some of the moments of great joy that you've experienced in creating something new?
You know, every day is a joy. At the very first start, it was the fact that I had to convince people. I even had to convince the students. I mean, obviously, if you were a student 10 years ago, because the master program is actually celebrating its 10th anniversary, well, they were very comfortable going for specializations like in corporate law, in taxation, in family law. Well, because these are, you know, the areas we are very familiar with, and you know what type of careers it can lead you to. So I had to first convince the students that they, you know, this was a very new field of specialization, and it could really bring them a new perspective of job, but also of career. And that was very challenging. Then I had to convince other faculty members and my colleagues, I mean, from the academia, because, I mean, now, today, everyone is talking about ethics and compliance, because we've got 2 major reforms in France. And so that brought things really, really at the very first stage of, you know, interest for everyone. But then, you know, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, even 4 years ago, you know, people were just looking at me and wondering what I was talking about, because these were not concepts we really had in France. And even though we had some regulation about transparency, about CSR, it had not been structured in the sense that it could have been really taught in programs. So that was very challenging. And the third challenge was to find the team whom would come and really give and deliver the classes, and try and think of the content of each seminar, of each class, and try and see how we could really bring the subject matter to the students. And that actually is something I've been revising every year since the creation, because we really want the master program to stick to the areas of interest for the business. And so you have to revise permanently. So my very first joy was when I got my students inside this program. They were sitting for the classes, they were delivered. And then after the program, they started getting jobs. And that was really fantastic. And every day now I am feeling this, these joyful moments whenever we've got now an alumni club of nearly 300 students who have graduated from the program. And so every time one of them writes to me saying, I'm going for a new job, and the titles are more and more interesting, the positions are higher and higher, and basically they are being hired as senior on senior positions only after 3 years of graduating from the program, which means that there is a need for this specialization, and also that the program brings them the level of the expertise that other people coming from a regular background inside the business do not have. So it's really great. And then even today, seeing that other universities actually in France are really starting to look into this specialization, and other programs have been launched. Actually, it is still challenging for me, because this means that we have got 10 years of existence, and now we have to look for the future challenges of the 10 coming years. And this really helps not to just be satisfied with what you've done and just look back, but always look ahead. Sure. And be able to find what will be the next challenge, and what are the topics, the issues of tomorrow, and really help the master program to be always at that level. And then the other joyful moment is when I've got students whom decide to go for a PhD, because this means that there is now research coming up on this different topics and issues. And there are many students in France also writing to me because they would like to go for a PhD on various subjects of ethics and compliance. And so this is very, very promising for the future. So we really have here a subject matter. It's a real legal field in which we are really trying to bring expertise.
So if I can listen to what you're saying, you don't see ethics and compliance as something apart from the legal profession, but rather a specialization, a drill down that lawyers should know about and be able to practice.
I think nowadays every lawyer has to know the main concerns of ethics and compliance, and this is important also for me, for all the judges, the magistrates. I mean, everyone who is entering a law school and graduating from a law school should know the basics of ethics and compliance. And then there is this, so you can basically become, join any legal profession, but knowing these basics. But then some can really get specialized in this area of expertise. And this is what the master program is offering. And for me, actually, it's very important to know the legal framework and the global legal framework, because when you are an ethics and compliance officer today, you are facing global issues, global regulation, and we really have to bring all this together and design and implement programs which at the same time have to be compliant with multiple jurisdictions.
So you've described basic knowledge. And I'll use another example. Most lawyers know something about estate law, wills and trusts.
Yes.
But then there are specialists who that's all they do. And then they specialize further and perhaps just look at elder law or law for very wealthy families or very poor families. So you see ethics and compliance as an ever-deepening area of specialization. Is there room in the field, in the practice of ethics and compliance, for non-lawyers?
I think there is. I mean, the difficult part is to bring non-lawyers to understand and address the legal issues ethics and compliance officers are dealing with. But then, to me, being a lawyer is not enough if you want to join the ethics and compliance officers, position. This is what we try to bring to our students too. It's very important to know the basics of finance, of economy, of business. So the first thing I tell my students is, even during your internship, they're doing their internships within, ethics and compliance, divisions, and I tell them, listen, ask your tutor if you can just go on the ground, just go to the units, to the business units, try and understand where you are, what the different activities are about, and try and understand the knowledge of the business you are in, because this is very important. So I think when we're talking of ethics and compliance, what is important is to think about the team. And then the team is supervised by a chief ethics and compliance officer. Now, if the chief ethics and compliance officer knows the legal issues and can address the legal issues, this is really very good. But he has to have the support of people coming from different backgrounds. Understanding HR is very important. Understanding finance is very important. Being able to do internal controls and auditing is very important. So I think, when we think of ethics and compliance, there are two things. It's the person who is the ethics and compliance officer, and then you've got the ethics and compliance, team, which has to bring different types of knowledge and have them, together in order to be able to address all the various risks to which a company or a business or organization, whatever, is faced.
So I want to turn our time together to two other areas that I hope we will be able to cover. One is, as I recall, the work you've done to mold the program to incorporate, first of all, the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals under the UN system. And then the last topic I want us to talk about, provided there's enough time, is what you think some of the challenges are. What are some of those big issues that we don't yet have a lot of answers to in the field of ethics and compliance, regardless of how it's structured or the credentialing, the multidisciplinary team that's brought to bear on those topics. So, Sustainable Development Goals, the things we haven't yet asked and answered.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the Sustainable Development Goals are very important. I mean, the way the program is designed is that we are trying to give the fundamentals of governance, corporate governance to the students. And this corporate governance includes many, many different topics. CSR and sustainable development is the basis. This is how everything started. This is how the business was driven into, the different the goals, which are the millennial goals. And then this is actually how Global Compact started. So this is really the starting point of many, many various initiatives at the global level. But then corporate governance means also identifying the type of governance you have to put into place inside an organization, and how you have to address the different issues. So if you're thinking of ethics and compliance, you have to make sure, the board has to make sure that there's a governance of ethics and compliance which is put into place. And for all the other topics, it's the same thing. And then we also try to address the risks. So corporate governance, but then risks. What are the different risks to which a business or an organization is facing, and how can they address those risks? So the risks are multiple. They could be financial, they could be criminal, they could be social, they could be of many, many kinds. And then the final point is compliance. So how can you build and design a program to be able to address those risks? So basically, the program is, what we're talking about is GRC, to be very,
and just and GRC, governance, risk, and compliance.
That's right.
As a mental model through which you both can deliver education and training for young entrants, as well as to think about in structuring an ethics and compliance program inside of a global corporation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So,
because the program is a professional program. So the students are doing 12 months of education plus at the same time 12 months of internship.
Right.
So it's very important to be able to, immediately have the possibility to experience all the education the theoretical part they're getting. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So that gives us some sense of the overlay or integration of UN Global Compact's 10 principles for corporations.
Yes.
And as the thinking around the globe matures around sustainable international development, how do you get those ideas of the responsibility of a corporation into the fundamental, almost assumptions of how we should operate in business?
Well, that is the main. That is the main, the sensitive issue of all this, of the whole program, and how to bring actually people to be able to think globally, and be able to. So basically, this needs to know perfectly well the laws and regulations of different countries, and to be able to think of what are the common cores you can find, and what are the specifics of each legislation. So basically, to my point of view, today you cannot do ethics and compliance just looking at the territory on which you are doing your business, because even if you are a small or medium-sized company, you will be contractors of major companies. So their global issues will be your issues, and you have to address those issues. And I think you asked me about the challenges to come. I think one thing we haven't, and that is going to be a major concern, is how we can help the small and medium-sized companies to do ethics and compliance, and to design ethics and compliance, and to understand the issues, first of all, of ethics and compliance, and then how we can help them really be able to address those issues in order to be able to work with the business at a global level and expand their activities. So that is, I think, a very, very huge challenge to come. I know that some medium and small-sized companies are really aware of this, and they are really thinking to, be able at their level to have programs. For example, I know right now in France, the expectation of the new anti-corruption agency, which has been put into place, is that it considers that not only major companies are concerned, so the agency has to help also the small and medium-sized company to be able to design and implement programs. So I think this is very this is the trickiest part. Is you really have to find the common cores again of all the different legislations and see if you can design something around that. But then the specifics are always there, and you always have to comply with it. So basically, you really need to do, I think, a lot of comparative law, be able to understand, the objectives of each law, and be able the goals of each legislation. And something I think is quite interesting to notice in France, I have less experience that in the United States, is that in France we always ask ourselves what are the links between hard law and soft law.
Okay, tell me more about that concept.
Yes, well, hard law is based on regulations which are imposed to individuals or to legal persons. So basically you just have to comply with the law and regulations. Soft law is the fact that you can be in a sort of an auto-regulation position. So you can issue norms, you can issue documents to which you are going to comply.
Yes.
And then the question is, what is the legal value of those norms which derive from auto-regulation? And it's very interesting to see that often actually the hard law allows a certain place to the to the soft law, but because the business does not actually take that opportunity to go for an auto-regulation, then the business is facing a hard regulation.
Yes.
So we've seen that, in financial,
Right.
finance. We experienced that with the executive compensation in France very recently.
Okay.
Because there is a code of corporate governance which is issued by the business itself. And so the business accepts to comply with this code, and the code was saying, okay, basically the shareholders are supposed to give their opinion about the compensation which is going to be given to the executive. And actually the companies did not apply that rule. So what happened is that now we've got a hard regulation imposing, which is imposing to all the business, and they all have to ask their shareholders and then take into account the decision of the shareholders.
As
and
they
so,
set executive compensation.
Exactly.
Sure.
So that's, you see, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, and I think that the business is getting more and more aware of the fact that when it's given the tools, the means, and the scope of auto-regulation, it should seize the opportunity in order to avoid a hard regulation. And so this, this link and this link between hard law and soft law is something very interesting to experience in France. And actually, the question came very early with the Code of Conduct because of the Sarbanes-Oxley. The companies were drafting their Code of Conduct, and then the question was, okay, what's the legal value? Can you ask all your employees tomorrow, and can you, apply disciplinary sanctions on the basis of violations to the Code of Conduct? So all these questions, were really new, but we still have this, this debate between hard law and soft law going on.
So if I listen through what some of the themes are that we've talked about today, one is the contours of the profession, and that is the balance of part of or a specialization of law as a career and a profession, as a learned profession, or something a little bit different, a standalone for which there are synergistic overlaps.
Yes.
We've talked about developing a new major, a new area for professional development for students, and the joy of seeing 300 students launched into their careers.
Yes.
We've talked about the engagement with corporate compliance officers and ethics officers who you learned from to figure out what the need is.
Yes.
We've also talked about this fascinating idea of hard and soft law, regulation and law imposed by a national sovereign, a country, or the organic soft law self-regulatory or self-governance
Yes.
materials that are also necessary for organizational life.
Yes.
And how those balance. We spoke a little bit about one of those, what I would call questions that we've now asked and answered. And one of those that you've said so clearly is, we're all global. No matter large or small, all business today is global. And then you've described how to find the principles that are common throughout multiple and multiply different legislative schema.
Yes.
And then how do you manage to comply with that, be true to the principles? And then the last piece you said, and what's one of the big challenges for the future, is extending these concepts to small and mid-sized organizations. How do you then democratize, expand education and access to this field? If we think that it's both a legal specialty and an emerging profession that is parallel to but not the same as the practice of law, how do we get others to come to our party?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we are offering a program which is addressed to students at the law school, but this does not mean that the function of ethics and compliance officer is just, belongs to the legal profession. I think there are today many people whom are interested in reorienting their careers, and they are considering this position because they have got a very significant background in other subjects or in other areas of expertise. And so I think we should, what we call, in the sense of continuing education, be able also to bring people whom are already professionals of different backgrounds to be able to get educated to this ethics and compliance role, and then be able to apply for jobs in this position. And so something is, I think, very interesting which comes out of that is that basically today the function and the role of ethics and compliance officer is really at stake. It is very important to be able to, if I gave a subject to my students, a dissertation this year. It was just compliance officer. And then I divided them into 3 groups. And they came up with 3 ideas. The first is that we have to talk about the liability of a compliance officer. The second is that we have to talk about the role and the function of the compliance officer. And the third is that we have to talk about the governance of ethics and compliance within an organization. And all this actually is linked to the ethics and compliance officer. And so this is just to say that this is a huge question which has to be today debated, because I think maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, these questions, we addressed them as far as the head of HRs were concerned, where, that function started to come up. So today, these questions, we really have to address them again, considering the job of ethics and compliance officers. So I think there is really a place and a room for everyone who is interested to, interested in this position and the different actions of an ethics and compliance officers. But then I think that coming from other backgrounds, you really have to be educated to understand the legal issues. Maybe you will not be able to address them as well as a lawyer will do, but at least you have to understand the issues, the legal issues, because making sure that the company is not facing any risk, it's 80% a legal matter. And then the 20% actually is based on all the other knowledge you have to have and have to gather to be able to address that issue. So I think this is a huge, this is a sort of a very significant position job in which you can really have people coming from various backgrounds. But the common core for me is to be able to understand the legal issues.
Okay, wonderful. So just to sum up, one other of those topics to follow in the next 20 years, liability of the ethics office, ethics officer, individuals in
Yes.
those roles, the role, the status, the structure of that position and that function,
That's right.
and then governance and oversight for that role and function.
Exactly.
So it used to be in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we talked about should there be a new privilege, a legal privilege for ethics officer communications. It didn't go anywhere. We thought about it for about 18 months, and none of the courts would take that up.
Yes.
So that was what I would call an asked and answered question, not worth revisiting. But you've now identified a whole next generation of issues that we leave to the researchers of the future.
Yes, and that's very challenging and interesting.
Right.